Hello, everyone. This is Dee Marley with the History Bards podcast. Thank you so much for joining us today. We have a special treat this week as we are interviewing historical author Susanne Dunlap, which is airing today, and a special content episode featuring her book, The Courtesan'S Daughter, and the history behind the early days of the New York film industry, which will air in a few days after this interview. Hi, Susanne. How are you doing today?
Hi, Dee. I'm doing fine, and I'm really happy to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
You're very welcome. Well, for all of our listeners, as a way of introduction, Susanne is the author of 12 works of historical fiction for adults and teens, as well as an author accelerator certified book coach. Her love of historical fiction arose partly from her studies in music history at Yale University, where she earned a PhD in 1999, and partly from her lifelong interest in women in the arts as a pianist and nonprofit performing arts executive. Her books run the gamut of being award winners, such as her novel, The Paris Affair, which won first place in its category in the CIBA Dante Rossetti Awards for Young Adult Fiction. And her featured novel, The Courtesan'S Daughter, won a 5-star highly recommended award of excellence from the Historical Fiction Company. Susanne earned her BA and MA musicology from Smith College and lives in Biddisford, Maine, and her little dog Betty, right?
Yes, it's Biddeford.
Biddeford?
Yeah, Biddeford.
Okay.
There's no S.
I knew I was going to say that wrong. Well, welcome to the show. And to get things started, we would love to know more about your book and how you got started writing historical fiction.
Well, let me see which order. Maybe I'll take the started writing historical fiction first.
Okay.
Because it's related to what you just did with my my little bio there, which thank you so much. It really, I have always been a writer of sorts in one way or another, but I've never really considered writing a book, or I did actually in my 20s, but thank God those things are completely lost to posterity.
Right, I understand that.
And so then I took a sort of an academic approach, and I ended up going to graduate school in musicology and music history. And when I got my PhD after a total of 11 years in graduate school, I wanted to teach. And unfortunately, it was at that very moment that colleges and universities across the country were decimating their humanities departments in favor of STEM. So when people retired, they weren't being replaced and all this sort of thing. Plus, I had teenage children, so I couldn't up and move halfway across the country and get an entry-level job. So I had to face the fact that I was not going to get a teaching position. Although I did have a year as a visiting assistant professor at Columbia University, which was fabulous.
Wow. Yeah.
Be that as it may, I had so much I wanted to share. I'd done all this work, and I had all these ideas and thoughts about music and women, and because I was very much on a sort of feminist bent for my studies. And I don't even know what inspired me exactly, but one day I just started writing a fictionalized version of something that I was working on, and ended up writing what I thought was a novel. And sent it out. An agent called me, and first thing he said to me is, "What you've written is not a novel." And he sent me away. He sort of said, "Go read this, do this stuff." And I'm a student at heart, so I said, "Okay, let me dig into that." And so I did, and I worked on it again, and I came back to him, and he ended up taking me on as a client and helping me with my first book. And so that's how I got into writing historical fiction. It was just like, oh, I can take this side of myself and this side of myself and put them together.
Yeah. Isn't that great how that happens? That's wonderful how that happens. So
and actually sorry.
No, go ahead.
the teaching side came in later too, because becoming a book coach sort of feeds my desire to teach people.
Oh, of course, of course. Well, I'm sure there's probably a lot of um, you know, historical fiction wannabes starting out on everything will be glad to know that you offer that. So everybody
Yeah,
contact Susanne Dunlap for to be a book coach. Well, let me ask you
yeah.
this with your book, The Courtesan's Daughter. So, like, what got you interested in this era in particular?
Well, and what's really fascinating is that I really knew nothing about the early film industry when I started. What I wanted to do, and it was sort of a nudge from my agent, really, was I wanted to write a story set in the early 20th century in New York. And I also realized as I looked back at my other books that mothers never figured in any of them. They were always absent in some way or another,
Yeah.
even my young adult books,
Uh-huh.
or just not very important. And so I decided to challenge myself to write a mother-daughter story.
Mhm.
And then I started digging around the time and, the things you stumble on in research. And I was
Of
like, oh my
course.
God, the film industry was just amazing. And I just
Yeah.
dove right in. And there was so much cool stuff about it that I just never would have known. And I'd lived in Brooklyn at various times. And I think I even saw, unfortunately, I think it's been torn down recently, but
Oh,
the big smokestack that
oh
had
yeah.
Vitagraph on
Oh my
it, you know,
goodness. That's amazing.
I know. I know, really. So it's hard to say. It was didn't come out of any long time desire to write about that. But my approach to historical fiction isn't always linked to what I already know about. I often use it to explore things I don't know yet.
Yeah, isn't that great? I really, that's one of the things I love about historical fiction is because you learn so much. And I'm
Mm. Yep.
constantly, challenging myself in that respect as well. So I completely get that. Well,
Hmm.
so one of my questions is about, have you ever traveled to any of the places, but you lived there? So you said that you
Well,
lived
I've
in
lived
Brooklyn.
in Brooklyn, and I knew New York pretty well from
Right.
so I had a sense of them, of some of the places there, of course. But it's always different because things change over
Oh
time.
yeah, of
Although
course.
Brooklyn, Brooklyn in the early 20th century isn't so much different from what it is now, except in, because I'm saying the same streets are there and all that,
Yeah, yeah,
as opposed to when I was writing in 18th century Paris.
right.
I had to have an 18th century map to look up what the street names were and how they went, because a lot of that changed in the 19th century with Haussmann, you know.
Right.
So,
Was you able to visit there whenever you were doing the research for that one?
oh, I've been to Paris several times,
Yeah,
and
me too.
and but again, the environment, if you're doing the 18th century, being in Paris doesn't give you that much. I mean, things like the bridges that had houses on them, and
Yeah,
they don't now.
right.
And the different streets. And what I found that was incredibly helpful was there's a famous map called the Turgo Map of France that this man did in 1730s, I think, and it has Paris to such a degree of detail that every
Oh,
building you can see the buildings and even some of them the names of the people who lived there,
oh,
and
that's so
like
fascinating.
trees in the parks and boats on the it's
Oh,
amazing, it's incredible, and it's freely available online.
oh, you'll have to send me
So
that link. I would love to see that.
I will. It's hard to see online, and I actually got a huge version of it printed out,
Oh,
like massive. But when I moved from Northampton to Maine, it got tucked away, and I left it behind by
oh
mistake.
goodness. Oh, what a shame. Well, I know,
Yeah.
that was probably really fascinating. I'm sure that some of our listeners would love to know that. So we'll put that link in our description, maybe that they
Oh
can
yeah,
go and
for
look at
sure.
that for research. Well,
Mhm.
talking about research, so what other kind of maybe like some obscure things or anything really interesting that you found in your research?
For this book, for Courtesan's Daughter,
Yes. Uh-huh.
there's well, I mean, it's astounding once you start. just looking for something, looking
Yeah.
for things. You find them, you stumble on them. It's just great. And there's a whole little book written about J. Stuart Blackton, who is the person who ran the Vitagraph
Hmm.
studio. And then, of course, Alice Guy Blaché, who is the French woman, a real pioneer in cinema, who spent some time in Brooklyn with her own studio there at the same time as my book takes place. And it was like,
Oh, great.
whoa.
Yeah.
But and you know, what's interesting too is that as you look around that area, I have another book that's going to come out in October that's written around the same time period, different,
Okay.
you know, New York and everything, but different subjects.
Uh-huh.
But you stumble into the same people. I mean, it
Mhm.
seems to me that someone like J.P. Morgan's daughter, and her name for some reason is gone from my head. But you know, there's all those people, you bump into them as you read again and again.
Right,
So you start
right.
to get the sense that you're in that area, and those people are part of the world. You know,
Mhm.
so yeah, that was interesting. I'm trying to think.
Yeah.
Oh well, the other thing that I sort of stumbled on, and I really cannot remember how, was this freak snowstorm in
Mhm.
March in New York in 1910. And it's like, I was just astounded. I thought, that's it. I need that snowstorm. That's
Yeah,
going to help my
absolutely.
story.
Absolutely.
So, yeah. And again, I couldn't have planned to have it that way.
Well,
It just was something. Yeah.
isn't that great how that always happens? It's like it just
Yeah.
all kinds of melds together and it was like it was supposed to be it was supposed to be in your story. And for our
Right.
listeners,
Exactly.
yeah. And for our listeners, the content episode that's going to come up following this interview is going to really delve into the history that you just mentioned about the snowstorm, about that Alice, say her name again, Alice Guy
Alice
Blaché.
Guy Blaché.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm going to make sure that I say it right in the content episode. So we'll
Well,
really,
it looks like Guy. It's spelled
yeah,
Guy, but it's
yeah,
Guy because it's French. Yeah.
right, right. Well, that is really fascinating. So let me ask you this. Do you have a favorite line or passage from your own book?
Oh, let me see.
Okay.
I don't know if I do. I mean, I sort of like, oh, I actually do have one.
Great.
And oh, here, and she says, I could hear my mother's voice. To be pretty, what is that? To be smart, to be educated, that is most important. No, I never really understood how that little French word, no, could so clearly mean its opposite.
That's great. That's
That
great.
was one of my favorite lines.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, in doing all of this research and writing this book, like if you was to go back and tell your younger self or give your younger self some advice, maybe some advice that would help younger historical fiction writers starting out, what advice would you give yourself?
I would say respect the history, but don't be a slave to it, because history is the inspiration. You don't want to mess around with things that people know about. But
Yeah.
in my first novel, for instance, I was agonizing and I over the fact that I wanted a certain Chopin study to be the piece that my protagonist played and studied with Franz Liszt,
Mhm.
the second book, and it was published. It was available in like 1833 in Paris, in France. But I decided I had to move the whole setting to 1832 because that was the year of the cholera epidemic in Paris. And that added stakes and drama and all that kind of thing. And so but I wanted to use that piece of music. So I thought, oh, well, I'll just move it to that. And, you know, and you can justify things like that. You just write your author's note, because
Author's notes.
the first thing you have to do is make the story. The story is the most important thing,
Right.
because nobody's going to read your book or make it all the way through if it's just dry history, not arranged
Exactly.
in a story. which has demands that supersede the
Yeah.
history.
Yeah, I agree.
No anachronisms, though. No anachronisms,
No
though.
anachronisms. One of the things that I remember advice given to me was like, I went to a writing retreat, and one of the advice was given was, as if it's a good story, you can break some of the rules. So, and
Yeah.
that's very true.
And and the other thing is, as soon as you put words into a historical figure's mouth, you're inventing things.
Yes, you are.
Because, you know, you can't, even if they have diaries or whatever, they don't talk that way.
Yeah.
So just the interactions, you have to allow your imagination, because that's what's beautiful about historical fiction, is it takes history and makes it real, brings it to life, and it lets a reader get totally absorbed in it. And you can't do that if you're just slavishly sticking to absolute factual research.
Yeah, exactly. I totally agree with that. Well, what did you find that was the most difficult about writing this book?
Um, I actually had some anxiety about one of my sort of important secondary characters, who was a Jewish man who supplies them with uh, piecework. I knew that at the time, the people doing piecework in their apartments, in their tenements, was not all that common. Most of that work had gone to the factories. But it was important. I needed that to happen. And so I had to sort of justify it in one way or another, which is that she's just such an accomplished seamstress that her mother is just such an accomplished seamstress.
Mhm.
But I also, I'm not Jewish, and I know a lot about the culture, about I have lots of friends and have been involved with things gone, but still writing a character like that,
Yeah.
I was a little bit anxious that I wasn't going to get him right,
Uh-huh.
or that I was going to make him a caricature of some
Right.
kind, which I didn't want to do.
Oh, yeah.
And that was a very difficult line for me to stick to, for
And
sure.
how do you feel about it now?
I think I did okay.
Good.
I think if somebody was really looking for it, for things, they could pick it apart. But I made him not sort of like super religious or anything, and I kept his relationship with Justine sort of mostly platonic, mostly a close friendship, so that I wouldn't have to, deal with marriage through religions, because she's Catholic. you
Mm.
know?
Okay.
So yeah. So that would have been, you know, tricky, but I
Yeah.
wanted them to have a warm relationship, and because I felt like they should really understand each other on some
Yeah.
level, and his love for for fabrics and for clothing and that sort of thing, meeting her incredible ability as a seamstress, seemed like something that could sew them together.
Yeah, absolutely.
And yeah,
Well, that's
yeah.
really fascinating. Um, how that happened sometimes, because you do want to like portray characters in a certain way. So I can see where that would have been a challenge to start out that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let me ask you this, because uh, like lots of us as authors, I know we all have like sayings that we live by or quotes that we live by. Do you have a favorite quote or saying that tells the listener something about you?
There's so many things I say to my clients, my book coaching clients, but they're not general enough. But I guess for historical fiction, relates back to what I said before. Fiction is the noun, historical is the adjective.
Hmm.
So it's got to be fiction, and historical is something that's overlaid on the fiction.
I think that's
Yeah.
great. That's actually a really good advice for, like I was talking about, the those that are starting out, to keep that in mind.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's so much
Yeah.
controversy sometimes about what is historical fiction. What should it entail? And that can be discussions that go on for quite some time.
Yeah. But you can do a lot of research and
Yes.
still, you have to make it into a story. I mean, I
Right.
think I do my research,
Right.
but think of, for instance, of someone like Hilary Mantel with
Um,
the Wolf Hall in that trilogy.
oh, yes.
So much of it is, I mean, there's no way it feels like she was there, but she
It
wasn't.
does. I know.
But her research is superb.
It
So,
is.
you know, it's it's hard to do well, I think. And it's also a really good idea to, I mean, we all research things and find stuff we find absolutely fascinating.
Yeah.
And we want to put it in our books because we're like, look at this cool thing. But
Yeah.
sometimes you just have to brutally cut it out because
Right.
unless it advances the plot, it does
Yes.
not belong there. Yeah.
Yes. That's exactly true. So
And
let's,
in fact, I had to cut
no,
a
go
whole
ahead.
chapter out of my book, The Portraitist, which
Wow.
a chapter I loved when somebody read it and said, this doesn't really take us anywhere. And I'm like,
Mhm.
no.
I know. It doesn't,
So
it
I
just
just
like
took it
tears
out.
your heart out.
Yeah.
Yeah. And sometimes as young authors starting out, I know I did that. I clung to things so much that but it's a learning process and you grow from
Mhm.
it. But sometimes you do
Yeah.
cling to those things so tightly when you're first starting out.
Hmm.
So Suzanne, tell us
Yeah.
a little bit about what you have coming up or any events or you was talking about you have another book coming out in October.
Yes. I actually have my first in-person book event a week from today
Oh, yay.
in the lobby of the hotel that's at the other end of my building. And I'm so excited because I've missed being able to interact with people and celebrate
Yes.
when there's a book coming out.
Right.
And I had my book, The Portraitist, came out at the end of August, but I was laid up because I had a compound ankle fracture and a broken leg
Oh,
that
oh
from
goodness.
a fall when I was walking, and I was non weight bearing for 6 weeks, and
Oh,
I went right through my when my book came out. So it's like I
oh,
couldn't
wow.
do it.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's coming up a week from today, as I said. I also teach workshops, although I think I've taught all the workshops I'm teaching this spring. Um, so I don't have anything to add for that, but I do love giving workshops through the Maine Writers and Publishers Association or another another organization in where I used to live in Massachusetts
Are those in
called Writers
person
in
or are they
Progress.
online?
They're all Zoom. They're all over
Okay.
Zoom.
Okay.
Yeah.
So maybe you
Um,
could I mean, do you have a way for people to sign up for those?
when they're coming, I don't think I have any scheduled right now,
Okay,
but
okay.
I usually put them on my calendar on my website, and
Okay,
also I
great.
talk about them a lot. So yeah.
That sounds good. And what about your book coming out in October?
Oh, I don't know the exact date of
Okay.
publication. I'm saying October. It's all done and ready and, about to be created, produced.
Good.
Um, that also takes place in early New York, 1906 to 1913.
Okay.
And it's called The Adored One, and it's a novel of Lillian Lorraine, and Florence Ziegfeld.
Oh,
And I'm not going to say any more about it.
no, don't say any more, but we'll be very excited
Yeah,
for that. That's like a fascinating history as well about the Ziegfeld, about
yeah.
the all of that.
Hmm.
Well, we'll be definitely whenever it comes out, we'll definitely do a spotlight on that whenever it's released.
Yeah,
Well,
I'll be
Suzanne,
excited for it.
yes, definitely. Suzanne, we
Yeah.
thank you so much for being on the show today. We really appreciate you being
Oh,
with us.
I really appreciate you having me. I mean, it's really nice to be asked intelligent questions by people who understand historical fiction.
Yeah, thank you. And love
So,
historical
yeah.
fiction. I just adore it.
Yes.
So we really do appreciate it. And to all our
Yeah.
listeners, we thank you and we ask that you please click that subscribe button. And once again, you can learn more more about Susanne and her books at www.susanne-dunlap.com. Plus, we invite you to come back to the podcast in a few days to catch the featured content episode, The Early Days of the New York Film Industry, which highlights the history behind Susanne's book, The Courtesan's Daughter. We hope everyone enjoyed today's episode. Tune in to next week's show when we have a double header, first with author Suzanne Wands, the author of Magician and Fool, and then with Lars Hedborg, the author of the spectacular Tales from a Revolution series. Thank you for listening, and as always, keep making history and keep listening.